Welcome to the last part of my series about a journey to the Hermit Kingdom, North Korea. In previous parts, I have covered all the landmarks we have visited around Pyongyang, our trip to the demilitarized zone between the two Koreas, an outstanding performance in the Mangyongdae Children's Palace, and also how we went to see preserved leaders in Kumsusan. On this day, it was time to say goodbye and to travel back to the People's Republic of China. So in this last part, I covered our trip back from Pyongyang and also gave some conclusions I had made after 5 days in the most isolated country in the world. In the morning of the last day, we got back our passports. While waiting in the lobby, I managed to document the promotional photos displayed behind the reception. They were showing all three dear leaders and the harmonious life in the DPRK. We saw the same pictures next to the Panmunjom shop 2 days ago, before going into the DMZ. We also saw the same pictures a bit later on the train station. Couple of weeks later, some of the people from our group also reported they saw exactly the same pictures in a display in front of the embassy of the DPRK in Berlin. Some members of our group have arranged for an extended stay in the DPRK and met their new guides. They continued their journey with them to the northern parts of the country. The rest of us boarded the local bus for the last time. While driving to the main train station, we passed by some huge science center. It also looked brand new but completely empty and almost unused. We were taken back to the main train station to wait for the departure of our train. While we were sitting in the waiting room, Roberto put his bags by one of the walls. One of the local officials immediately came to tell him to move them. His bags were leaning on the wall with the pictures of the eternal president and the dear leader on them. That was not allowed. He was just warned and everything was okay after he moved the bags. Soon after, we had to go to the train. We said goodbye to our guides who said they were sad to see us go and they invited all of us to visit again. We boarded the train and started the trip back to the Chinese border. On the way back, the weather improved and the countryside also looked more green and friendly. We talked and exchanged experiences and everybody had some details to share that someone else had missed. When we got to the border, we again faced the control of our belongings. I guess they compared the lists of publications and recording devices which were made when we were entering the country. They didn't check our smartphones or cameras to see what we filmed. Officers and soldiers were again friendly and polite, but also didn't speak any English. The English teacher from our group had his disposable contact lenses with him, and the officer checking our compartment was so fascinated with them as he obviously had never seen anything like it. He wanted to have one. Our companion wasn't sure what good would one of them be to him, especially without proper prescription. Still, he gave it to him in the end. I gave him some chewing gum. In the bag of one of the girls, he found a small box which looked like a pack of cigarettes. He opened it and there were tampons inside. He was very curious about the content and started examining it further. We did not know what to do after he took one of the tampons out of the box, for closer examination. It seemed like he had no idea what that was. He was looking at us for an explanation. He wasn't demanding, he was genuinely curious. We started to chuckle as we did not know what or how to tell or explain him, as there was a language barrier between us. The officer made a gesture toward his mouth to ask if that was something to eat. We all started waving to stop him. One of the guys from the compartment took the explanation upon himself and took a tampon in his hand. He pointed at us men in the compartment and showed a negative gesture. Then he showed to the girls in the compartment and showed a positive sign. Then he pointed down. The officer took another second, but then he figured it out. With a petrified look of understanding on his face, he immediately returned everything back to its places and back in the suitcase. He was also very interested in the Slovenian magazine Mladina I had with me. At that time, Trump had just won the American presidential elections and Hillary Clinton lost. A caricature of both of them was on the front page. Officer was astonished. He pointed and asked, "Trumpu?" I replied, "Yes." He pointed again and asked, "Hirari?" "Yes." He started laughing. That was the loudest and most honest laughter I heard from a local during our whole stay in the country. He called his comrades to join him and they started going through the magazine. Whenever they saw a familiar face, it was again Trumpu and Hirari. They were studying it very carefully until their superior came to see where they were. Looking very serious, I guess he said something like "hurry up," because he was pointing at the watch at the same time. They soon returned the magazine and left. In the end, they let us through the check without problems. They didn't confiscate anything and ended our surprisingly pleasant stay in North Korea. I must repeat once again that luckily no one from our group did not have any trouble during our whole stay. They treated us well and we also learned a lot. We came back to the main station in Dandong. Some of us traveled back to Beijing immediately and some stayed in Dandong. They had a couple of days planned for visits here as well. One of the main attractions here is the end of the Great Wall of China. In any case, it was time to say goodbye to the comrades we made on this unique trip. The question on everybody's mind was, what did we take with us from the trip to the Hermit Kingdom, beside the things from numerous shops we were taken to. We all went there because of our curiosity and to see with our own eyes if the stories about North Korea are true. Could something like that still exist in the 21st century? More than 30 years after the era of thunderous communism has come to a crushing end. Unfortunately, it can. We all learned a lot and experienced that system firsthand. For every one of us, it was something completely different from what we saw before. Also, it is completely different to read or hear about such a system and its absurdities and to experience it firsthand. We really were on the tour from the moment we entered the country until the moment we left it. I believe the whole trip was organized to show the country in the best possible way. We heard and saw a lot of information about their way of life and most of it can be seen as propaganda. all the staff we encountered during our trip did their best so that we saw only what they wanted us to see. The whole time in the DPRK and our whole stay in the country was carefully orchestrated, beginning with Mansu Hill to the Kumsusan and the Mangyongdae Children's Palace. The whole trip was an attempt to show the country and the leaders as impressive and awe-inspiring as possible. Their leadership claims to be resisting the imperialism of world powers, in the first place the American one. That is their justification for all the investments in military and government control. While all the feats and shiny buildings they showed can be considered to be impressive, those things that lurk behind them, poverty, crumbling buildings, deteriorating infrastructure and restricted movement, paint the real picture for me. In my videos, I also did my best to be as objective as it was possible. I presented what I was sure that I saw with my own eyes and what I have heard in the explanations of our guides. There were instances when some of my fellow travelers said they saw soldiers with assault rifles guarding people working in the fields. I personally did not see that, so I cannot confirm it. On another instance, some of them thought that they saw mannequins in the stores around Pyongyang. Not in the shop's windows, but to make it look like there were people shopping inside. I experienced a similar thing. Even today, I'm not sure if I saw some human-sized dolls on one construction site we passed 2 times in a short time period. It was a construction site we saw while going to and from the National Gift Exhibition House. The workers there were in suspiciously similar poses both times. I wasn't completely sure what I saw, so I didn't mention it before. Again, we mostly saw what the organizers and our guides wanted us to see. Because of that, every trip and visit seemed fake in a way from the start. We would go from the almost empty hotel to a bus and to a completely empty museum. After, we would go to a completely empty park. For lunch, we would go to a restaurant which was most likely emptied only because of us. Also, I must say that because of that I became quite paranoid until our return back to China. They trained us to walk in pairs each time we got off the bus, so we started doing that on our own, without our guides even having to tell us. I even started to think that they are intentionally turning up the bus's air conditioning in some locations to fog up the windows so we couldn't see certain things. I could sound egocentric to think so many things would be arranged only for us, but honestly, that is what I started believing before the end of our trip. For me, I can say that the experience in general can be described as extremely interesting, as I learned a lot through first-hand experience. I can also say that I often describe it as both hilarious and horrible at the same time. Hilarious because of many often silly things that are part of their propaganda and we had to hear. Cure for cancer, counting years from the conception of Kim Il-sung, the language they are using when speaking about their leaders. The Kim dynasty being responsible for literally everything that has been achieved since the struggle against the Japanese onwards. They are constantly trying to make all the leaders the best and equally irreplaceable. On the other side, thinking about our trip becomes horrible when you realize how ordinary people must be living in that country. Economic and health problems, isolation, brainwashing with constant propaganda and personality cult, just to name a few of those horrors. Do not get me wrong, I am aware of the similar processes elsewhere and I do not want to value a country by the fact of how many McDonald's or shopping malls it has or does not have. I realize that there are similar things to personality cults in the West as well. People are adorning their celebrities, politicians, footballers and traditional rulers. Those are all valid points, but I believe everyone can clearly see the difference between liking or supporting something and being forced into loving and supporting your oppressors. For example, in the United Kingdom, people are not scoundreled if they put a suitcase against the wall with the picture of the Queen on it. It is not mandatory to wear badges with your president at all times. There is one very simple indicator which clearly shows how free the country is. It is the ability to criticize and make fun of your leadership. Even if people in the West are not happy with their system and leaders, they are at least free to voice their dissatisfaction. Nobody in North Korea has ever spoken against the eternal president, the general or supreme leader, as they are infallible. Another aspect which makes my memories from the trip partially horrible is when I remember the children. Subconsciously, you are somewhat okay with adults who have to live there, but then you realize that there are children growing up there as well. They grow up thinking that things have to be like that and that there are no alternatives. They have to listen and believe the propaganda almost from birth. Looking into the future of the country and thinking about what could happen next does not paint a pretty picture for the people living under the regime there. Even before, the North Korean army was a formidable force because of its numbers, even if most of their equipment is outdated. Since Kim Jong-un expanded their nuclear arsenal and has means to deliver it to South Korea, Japan and maybe even further, I believe military action is completely out of the question. On the other side, Western democratic countries have tried the tactic of waiting for the system to collapse from within, that their economy would crumble under the weight of international isolation and sanctions. Unfortunately, that is a tactic that is not completely successful. In the end, the people hurt the most are the innocent civilians living under the regime. That regime is actually getting more propaganda material that way and can say to their people, you see how evil the West is. I also must say that it seemed that some people from our groups were at least partially falling for the propaganda we were shown. I could hear, well, you see that it isn't so bad here. It seems they are just misunderstood and it's worse in China. I must say that I disagreed then and I disagree up to this day. On the other hand, somebody could ask if the situation is so bad for the people living in the DPRK, why don't they do something about it? Why don't they revolt and change their government? This solution is not so simple. As we saw, people in the DPRK are living isolated and do not have means to organize or join together. Phones, televisions and especially computers are practically non-existent in the countryside. Even electricity itself can be a luxury, as we saw with our own eyes. In addition, the role of the massive military is not actually to protect the country from the foreign invaders, but to protect the regime against their people. Most of the larger villages and settlements have their own barracks. From there, soldiers who are kept loyal by benefits or blackmailed by threats to their families are keeping an eye on the population around them. In that kind of conditions, I don't think that people would ever be able to organize and change something. In my opinion, the only somewhat viable way of that country collapsing is by the passage of time. One of the main issues I saw in the country is that most of their infrastructure is crumbling to pieces. Most of it was built in the late 50s and then in the 60s and 70s. It is slowly crumbling to disrepair. The roads, railway tracks, bridges, highways, electric posts, they are full of holes as they are not being maintained. I saw electric transmission lines made from concrete, but they are already so old that they had to tie them together with wires and planks to keep them from falling apart. It is questionable how much longer bridges will be able to stand before they start collapsing. Their public buses, trams and trains are in such a bad shape that I am wondering how much longer will they be able to operate. I believe it must be the same in power plants and other important locations. The leadership of North Korea is pumping the most of their money into the military to stay in power because of the foreign and domestic threats. What remains of the budget is proving too little for a stable country. There is some help and import coming from China, which I believe is the only thing keeping the machines operational and preventing the whole country and infrastructure from collapsing. China has a great interest in keeping the situation in North Korea exactly as it is, because it would face many problems otherwise. For one, if the DPRK would collapse, they would face a massive refugee crisis. Secondly, they would get an US ally on the border, even if they would, in a way, absorb the stumbling North Korea. The sad question is, can the people wait so long for the infrastructure and their leadership to collapse? I hope that happens sooner than later. People living there deserve normal lives. In some crazy thinking, I imagine that it would be educational to preserve a part of the capital as it is now. Propaganda could be preserved as a tour in some kind of massive museum of totalitarianism. People could come here and see how it is to live under an oppressive rule, have their movement restricted and be bombarded by propaganda almost constantly. There are no perfect countries or societies. Every country has its own problems and issues. I saw that in what little I have traveled around the world. But when visiting the DPRK, everyone can see how easy it is to lose and how difficult it is to live without all the liberties and freedoms we have and take for granted.